The town that played the whole world. The true story of Lone Pine, California, and the movie sets that vanished into the desert. You have seen this place 1,000 times. You have just never known its name. You saw it when the cavalry thundered through the Khyber Pass. You saw it when the gladiator knelt in the dust of a faraway empire, and when the spaceship crashed on an alien world, and when a giant worm burst up through the desert floor to swallow a pickup truck whole. Every one of those places was the same place. A jumble of strange, rounded golden rocks at the foot of the tallest mountain in the country, in a lonely valley on the far side of California. The town at its feet is called Lone Pine, and for more than 100 years it has quietly been the most filmed landscape in the American West, a little desert town that has spent a century pretending to be everywhere else on Earth. Lone Pine sits in the Owens Valley, on the 2-lane highway that runs up the dry eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. It is a small place, a few hundred people, a single main street, a diner, a hardware store, a couple of motels. But when you stand on that main street and look west, you are looking straight up at Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the lower 48 states, over 14,000 feet of granite, catching the morning light. And between the town and the mountain sits the strangest piece of ground in California, the Alabama Hills. They do not look like they belong here, where the Sierra behind them rises in sharp cathedral spires. The Alabama Hills are low, rounded, and warm-colored. Great heaps of tan and gold boulders, stacked and balanced and worn smooth, riddled with arches and hollows and passages. Geologists will tell you they are almost exactly the same age as the towering Sierra behind them. They were simply weathered differently, rounded off over millions of years into these soft, otherworldly shapes. They look less like California and more like the surface of some other planet, which, as it happens, is exactly why Hollywood came. The name itself is a piece of leftover history. In the 1860s, prospectors working these hills, men who happened to sympathize with the South during the Civil War, heard news of the Confederate raiding ship the Alabama, prowling the seas and sinking Union vessels. They admired her, and they named their mining claims, and then the whole range of hills, after the ship. The ship was hunted down and sunk off the coast of France in 1864. But her name stuck to a range of rocks in the California desert, and it is still there today. Long before any of that, this valley belonged to the Owens Valley Paiute, the Numu, who lived along the streams that ran down from the Sierra for thousands of years, farming with a network of irrigation ditches they had dug by hand across the valley floor. It was a hard, beautiful, and fragile place to live, dependent entirely on the water coming down off those mountains, and that dependence would one day become the valley's tragedy. But we are getting ahead of the story. The town of Lone Pine was born in the 1860s as a supply stop, feeding the mines and the ranches of the Owens Valley. It took its name from a single tall pine tree that once stood at the mouth of the canyon nearby, and it very nearly died before its story truly began. In the pre-dawn dark of March 1872, one of the most violent earthquakes in California's recorded history tore through the Owens Valley. It struck almost directly beneath Lone Pine. The little town was built mostly of adobe brick, and the adobe simply came apart. Walls collapsed onto sleeping families in the dark. 27 people died in a town of only a few hundred, most of them in a matter of seconds. The survivors buried their dead in a common grave just north of town, and you can still visit that spot today, a low mound behind a stone marker beside the highway. The quake was so powerful, it reshaped the land itself, dropping and lifting the ground along the base of the hills. Lone Pine picked itself up out of the rubble and rebuilt. It had no way of knowing that its real fame was still half a century away. and that it would arrive not by rail or gold, but on a strip of film. It began, as so many lost things do, with movies that no longer exist. In 1919, a film crew came to the Alabama hills and shot 2 silent pictures among the rocks. One called Water, Water Everywhere, and another called Cupid, the Cowpuncher. They were among the very first films ever made in Lone Pine, and today, not a single frame of either one survives. Like so much of early Hollywood, the fragile nitrate film they were printed on decayed or burned or was simply thrown away, and the movies vanished completely. The first chapter of Lone Pine's film history is, fittingly, a ghost. The oldest Lone Pine film that does survive came the very next year. In 1920, a crew arrived to shoot a western called The Roundup, starring one of the biggest comedy stars in the world at the time, Roscoe Arbuckle, the man everyone knew as Fatty. His friend Buster Keaton turned up for a small part. When audiences saw those weird, tumbled golden rocks backed by the snow-covered Sierra, something clicked. Here was a landscape that looked like the mythic west of the imagination, grander, stranger, and more beautiful than the real thing. The word went out around the studios. If you needed the West to look truly epic, you went to Lone Pine. What turned a scenic spot into a working film capital was a local rancher named Russell Spainhower. Spainhower understood, earlier than most, that these Hollywood crews needed things: horses, wagons, guides who knew the country, flat ground to pitch their tents, and someone local to make it all happen. So he became the man the studios called. He rented them his animals and his land, scouted their locations, and eventually built a standing western town set on his Anchor Ranch, south of Lone Pine, a fake frontier street complete with storefronts that the studios could rent by the day. The locals called it Anchorville. For decades, if a picture needed a cowboy town, it could roll into Anchorville in the morning and be filming a gunfight by noon. Through the 1930s and 40s, Lone Pine became the beating heart of the B-Western, the cheap, fast, endlessly popular cowboy pictures that filled American movie houses every Saturday. The great screen cowboys practically commuted here: Hopalong Cassidy, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Tom Mix. Kids across the country grew up watching their heroes gallop through those golden rocks, never knowing they were all riding through the very same few square miles of one small California valley again and again and again. And then, in 1938, Hollywood did something audacious in these hills. It turned the California desert into India. The director George Stevens brought a huge production to Lone Pine to film Gunga Din, a sweeping adventure set on the northwest frontier of British India, starring Cary Grant and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The Alabama hills, standing in for the Khyber Pass, were transformed. Crews built an enormous British colonial fort out in the rocks and a towering golden temple of Kali in a hidden hollow that is still called Temple Pocket to this day. Hundreds of cast and crew lived for weeks in a canvas tent city pitched along the dirt track that everyone now simply calls Movie Road. For a few months, a corner of the Owens Valley became the British Empire, complete with cavalry charges sweeping across the desert. And here is the part that makes Lone Pine a true lost California story. When the cameras stopped, those magnificent sets did not go to a museum. The fort and the temple were torn down, and the lumber was too valuable to waste, so it was hauled off and used to build other things. Some of the wood from the Gunga Din sets, the story goes, ended up framing a hacienda set back on Spainhower's Anchor Ranch. The Empire's fortress became a cowboy's ranch house. All across these hills, whole worlds were built and struck and recycled. Cities and temples and frontier towns that stood for a single film and then vanished back into the desert. leaving only the rocks exactly as they had always been. The rocks, it turned out, could play anything, and long after the era of the singing cowboys faded, the cameras never really left. Alfred Hitchcock shot part of a thriller here. Science fiction discovered the hills, and the same boulders that had been the Old West and colonial India became distant planets and alien frontiers. The crew of Star Trek climbed these rocks. A giant underground monster terrorized the town of Perfection in the creature feature Tremors, with Kevin Bacon running across ground you would recognize in an instant. Then came the modern blockbusters. Russell Crowe strode through the Alabama hills as a Roman general in Gladiator. Robert Downey Jr. crashed to Earth and built his escape in the opening of Iron Man among these very rocks. They turn up in Django Unchained, in Man of Steel, in commercials you have half noticed your whole life. All told, more than 400 films have been shot in and around Lone Pine, plus hundreds of television episodes and countless advertisements. There may be no single piece of ground on Earth that has appeared in disguise in front of more moviegoers. But there is one more story written into this valley, and it is not one that Hollywood put there. All the while the cameras were turning Lone Pine into empires and alien worlds. The valley around it was quietly being emptied of the one thing that made it live: its water. Beginning early in the 20th century, the growing city to the south, more than 200 miles away, bought up the Owens Valley's water rights and built a great aqueduct to carry the Owens River up and over the mountains and away. The river that had fed the Numu's hand-dug fields for thousands of years was turned from its course and sent south to fill swimming pools and green lawns in a distant city. And south of Lone Pine, Owens Lake, once a broad blue sheet of water that steamboats had actually crossed, was left with nothing coming in. Within a couple of decades, it dried up almost completely into a blinding white plain of alkali dust that the wind lifts into choking storms to this day. The valley that spent a century playing so many faraway places on film had a real disappearing act of its own, a whole lake that simply walked off into the desert and never came back. The town has finally learned to celebrate what it is. You can drive Movie Road yourself, a winding loop of graded gravel off the Whitney Portal Road with a map that marks the exact spots where Hopalong Cassidy reined in his horse, where the Gunga Din fort once stood, where Iron Man crawled from the wreckage. On the main street sits the Museum of Western Film History, opened in 2006, packed with saddles and posters and props from a century of pictures. And every fall since 1990, the little town throws a film festival, and the actors and the fans and the historians come back to the rocks where it all happened. In 2019, the Alabama Hills were finally given federal protection as a national scenic area. The movie set, at last, preserved as itself. And so Lone Pine holds all of it at once. The Valley of the Numu and their hand-dug ditches, the rocks named for a Confederate ship that sank an ocean away, the town shaken to rubble in the dark and rebuilt, the lost films of 1919, Fatty Arbuckle and the Cowboys, the fort that became a ranch house, the temple that dissolved back into the desert. Every hero and monster and empire that has ridden across those golden boulders while the same eternal mountain watched from behind. There are places all over California that reached for fame and never found it. Lone Pine found it by accident, and then spent a century in disguise. A small desert town on a lonely highway that quietly became the backdrop for the dreams of the whole world. Many people will drive right past Lone Pine without stopping. Many will watch those rocks their entire lives and never learn the name of the town at their feet. But now you know. That's the story of Lone Pine, California. And we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Los California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We'll see you there.